Fora TV. The world is thinking.
Thanks. So, good morning. My name's Sarah Boys. I'm Assistant Editor of Culture Wars, the online review of the Institute of Ideas, and I'll be chairing this first session of the Battle of Ideas 2008, Courting the Web, Who Controls the Internet. But before we kick off, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Natalie Melton from Arts and Business. Arts and Business are our sponsors for the 4th year running, and she'd just like to say a few words before we begin. Thanks, Natalie.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here and ready for what will undoubtedly be another vigorous and exciting debate. Arts and Business are delighted to be supporting the Battle of Ideas for the 4th year in a row, as Sarah says. It's always wonderful to have so many dynamic fora for different issues across 2 days. And I think it's particularly timely for us to be supporting a series of debates that look at the role of technology in society, and particularly later on this afternoon in relation to arts and culture, as it's going to be one of the major strands of our own research activity over the next year. Technology and innovation very often mean that the policy making, the speed at which things change, policy making and debate follows in their wake, and I think it's a great opportunity to just reflect on some of the real challenging issues that affect all of us in terms of how technology is reshaping the world in which we live. So I'm really, really delighted to be here to listen and learn from our panel of speakers and from all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. So to explain a bit about the format of the debate before we begin, each speaker will introduce on the topic of digital freedom for 5 to 7 minutes. We'll have a brief discussion up here on the panel to tease out the various issues before coming straight out to you guys in the name of public debate for questions, comments, provocations, insults, songs, you name it, we'll take it. I'd remind you the slogan of the Battle of Ideas is free speech allowed. So for this weekend only, we're granting you your right to free speech. Please make the most of it. So the topic of free speech is, of course, key to this debate about digital control and authority. And each of the speakers is a defender of free speech in one way or another. However, exactly what this means when it comes to thinking about the internet, and conversely what it means to censor online, is far from clear today. So the main question I'd like to address this morning is what free speech means in a digital age. The rise of the blogosphere and Web 2.0 technology has been heralded as a new democratic force, even a digital utopia, championed as an unrestrained space and for the way it facilitates user engagement and participation. With any person able to write a blog, comment on a website, or contribute to Wikipedia or YouTube, it seems that the web has secured freedom of speech for everybody, and the libertarian nature of its technologies makes for a situation where it is users themselves and not traditional authorities who are finally and firmly in control. Does this render the need to campaign for freedom of speech irrelevant then? But closely following the rise of the web have been its detractors. Indeed, the standard presentation of the internet is of it as being a threat to children, to privacy, to public morality, even to knowledge itself. Calls for regulation of the web have come from both above and below. Culture Secretary Angie Burnham and Home Secretary Jackie Smith announced the need for tighter government regulation at the end of this week, along with recent outcries over videos of kids wielding knives or suicide sites in the mainstream press. It seems the web is becoming more heavily regulated than real life. Are we seeing the dawn of a new public morality that is simply scared about what people might say and do when given free rein? Does Web 2.0 really protect the new participation its defenders might claim, or are we simply seeing the reproduction of real-world power structures in the digital realm? Has the web transformed intellectual culture and changed the way we contest ideas, or is it really just another technology? Does, or even could, Web 2.0 make us freer? Or is there a catch when the final decision is made by regulators or in response to popular pressure from the press? And when it comes to thinking about what a freer web would look like, is there a role for regulatory bodies like the Internet Watch Foundation, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning? Finally, what can we make of a modest concept of digital freedom? Should we stand up for net libertarianism, back some sort of online regulatory body, or simply stay cynical? So to tackle these questions and much more, I'll introduce the panel in the order that they're going to be speaking. So firstly, we have Joe Glanville, Jo is a director of the Index on Censorship since 2005. She's previously been a current affairs producer at the BBC for 8 years and has produced and presented several documentaries in this role. She writes and speaks regularly on the topic of censorship and has contributed to a number of publications, including The Guardian, New Statesman and Prospect, and Jo will be talking this morning about the privatisation of censorship. Secondly, we have Rob Killick. Rob is the founder and director of the founder and CEO of the digital agency Seascape, one of the sponsors for this session and long-time sponsor of the Battle of Ideas. So great to have you here again this morning. Rob, speaking on one of your specialist topics, privacy. So Rob will be addressing for us the question of how to go about balancing free speech and privacy when it comes to the internet. Thirdly, we have Cassandra Wilkinson, who's flown all the way over from Australia to be with us this weekend. So glad to have you here, Cassandra. Cassandra has worked for nearly a decade as a senior political advisor, and her recent book, Don't Panic, Nearly Everything is Better Than You Think, she says, celebrated the victories of modernity and laughed in the face of pessimists and killjoys everywhere. So hopefully you have some of that on the panel this morning. And fourthly, lastly but not leastly, is Dr. Tim Jordan from the Open University. Tim has researched and published widely on the effects of the internet and new social movements. He is co-founder of the journal Social Movement Studies, Journal of Social, Political and Cultural Protest, and amongst other things claims to have a psychosocial reading of Pokemon. So maybe more about that later, but Tim will be speaking this morning on the libertarian nature of the web and how that influences its social uses. And he's asked me to let you know that his recent book, I think is out in August, is that right, Tim?
It's just out.
Oh, just out, yeah. And that's called Hacking, Technological Determinism and Digital Media. Okay, so thanks, Jo. 5 to 7 minutes.
Morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Just very, very small noise. Small correction. I'm the editor of the journal Index on Censorship. I'm not actually the director of the organisation. It's a journal that comes out 4 times a year and covers issues around censorship and freedom of speech. I'm going to talk about the new agents of control, the new censors. I think that one of the most surprising things has been how far the internet has been a revolution for censorship as much as for free speech. And that's something that the great libertarian godfathers of the net really hadn't bargained for. It's a revolution not just in terms of technology, but in terms of who does the censoring. And it's no longer just the big boys. It's not the media magnates, the state, the corporations. There's a whole host of middlemen who now get to decide what we can and can't read and what we can and can't post. Most important of all, they're unaccountable. Much of what they do, therefore, isn't transparent, and there's even a level of secrecy that is protected by law. Let me give you an example. One of the most popular filtering software programs is a program called Smart Filter that's owned by a company called Secure Computing in California. It's a company that's actually just been bought by another big industry giant, McAfee, for $465 million. It's used by some of the world's most authoritarian regimes, including Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's also used in the United States. Now, the list of sites that are blocked by companies like Secure Computing are so secret that not even the countries that use the software know what's actually being censored. These lists are the intellectual property of the software companies, and they're protected by copyright. We know as much as we do because of the great research of organisations like the Open Net Initiative and because of the very brave detective work done by certain individuals like very brilliant researcher Seth Finkelstein and another one called Ben Edelman. And they've done this research at the risk of prosecution under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act because no one can legitimately examine these lists or ask for a review of them because of the fact that they are protected by copyright. Now, when Seth Finkelstein started examining Smart Filter's lists, he found that one of the categories for blocking sites was extreme or obscene, as you might expect. That would be one of the categories. But among the sites blocked, he found extremeoffroad.com, which was a page dedicated to high-speed desert off-roading, and another one, climbingmedia.com, which was a website for people who like climbing. So in that case, it seemed that the phrase extreme rock might have denied keen climbers in Tunisia the chance of reading the site. Gay and lesbian sites have also ended up being classed as pornography. This might surprise you, but when the free expression group Reporters Without Borders wrote to the Saudis pointing out that gay and lesbian sites were being blocked, the Saudis actually lifted the ban. Homosexuality is banned in Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis were more concerned about banning pornography than anything else. So that's quite an interesting case. I'm picking on Smart Filter, but they're just one of a number of these unaccountable secret censors who are, with no irony, successfully exporting censorship from the land of free speech, from the United States. Just this week, you might have seen that Yahoo, Google, and Microsoft have signed up to a code of conduct that will oblige them to, well, not oblige them, but it's a voluntary agreement that they will protect free expression as part of their business practices. And it's designed to stop the kind of thing happening, as many of you may know, in China, when the Chinese journalist Xi Tao's details were passed over by Yahoo in Hong Kong to the authorities, and he's now serving a 10-year prison sentence. Now, this negotiation, this code of conduct has taken 18 months to hammer out, and the next stage now is to try and persuade hardware and software companies to sign up. Cisco, which is another American company, is a prime candidate. They were invited to the initial discussions but didn't take part. And it's Cisco who provided China with the hardware, the routers, the switches to build its firewall. And their own shareholders have actually attempted to get them to sign up to some kind of human rights strategy. They failed at the last attempt. There's now another attempt taking place at the moment. In a couple of weeks, there'll be a vote. And I imagine it's unlikely again that it will be successful. Cisco's argument is that, much like the sale of nuclear technology, their hardware is a question of dual use, that they're not responsible for how it's used. That's their defense. So censorship, the control of information, has for the first time in its history actually become a commercial enterprise. That's one of the most extraordinary changes, I think. And it's carried out, is clear, by people who are unaccountable and who are protected by law from being transparent about what they're actually doing. There's one group of researchers who were looking into another aspect of censorship on the quiet, which is the whole question, the system of takedown notices. And as many of you may know, there's a procedure called notice and takedown where internet service providers are asked to remove illegal or harmful material, which may be because of copyright infringement or defamation. There's a group of researchers who did quite a famous experiment, and they came up with the phrase, the privatization of censorship, to describe what's happening. They set up a website with text from J.S. Mills on liberty, and they put up on the web an excerpt appropriate enough about censorship. They then created a fake organization called the J.S. Mill Heritage Foundation. They sent takedown notices claiming that copyright had been infringed, and obviously 19th century work, there's no question of copyright. But the ISP in the UK immediately obliged and took it down. In the US, they put up a bit more of a fight, but it was a very good example of how material may be censored without any questions asked, and materials is censored when it should not be censored. Now, these takedown notices have turned out to be a very serious chilling effect for free speech. You might have seen actually quite an interesting case in the States recently with CBS, Fox, and other television stations sending a takedown notice to YouTube to get Palin and McCain's campaign clips taken down because they claimed it was an infringement of their copyright, when in fact it was just a few seconds, 10 seconds or so of clips. It comes under fair use. There was no problem. It should not have been taken down. So it's quite interesting and heartening to see McCain and Palin writing a very robust letter to YouTube in defence of free speech and defence of political speech. The other big issue, of course, is defamation, where mere allegations of defamation can be enough for internet service providers to remove material. And this is a worldwide trend. But there are cases where the blogosphere has fought back very, very successfully, and which may be a sort of good sign for the future. There's a case here last year when the Russian oligarch Alisher Usmanov, who's a big shareholder in Arsenal Football Club, he got the big law firm Shillings to weigh in when Craig Murray, who was ambassador to Uzbekistan, published allegations on his website about Usmanov. As a result, his website was taken down. The whole website was taken down, and a whole load of other websites, including Boris Johnson's, I think, was taken down along with him. But the blogosphere fought back, and it ended up, I think, with the allegations being republished in around 500 different places. So that was a fantastic example of how to organise and combat this kind of chilling effect. There's a lot to address here, the whole question of the liability of internet service providers. Clearly there's a need for a proper legal process, the need for transparency, and the extent to which free speech has changed and censorship has changed with it, and that we clearly can't leave free speech just to defend itself alone online. Thanks.
Thanks, Jo.
Can you all hear me if I stand up? Good. When the internet began in the 90s, it used to be said that on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. And that spoke to the promise of anonymity that the internet brought, and the creation of what potentially was an incredible new public space, cyberspace, which was free from many of the limitations of time and space which we experience in other parts of our lives. But there's always been a contradiction at the heart of the internet as a public space, because although many of us treat it as if it is our public space in terms of communicating with each other and being creative and doing all kinds of stuff, the fact is that the digital nature of it makes it a highly contended type of public space, in the sense that it runs on networks which are owned by telecommunications companies. We leave digital traces of everything that we do, which are potentially recordable by those who run the whole thing. And increasingly through things like the social websites like Facebook, we are putting lots of data in the hands of private companies. Now, you may or may not know this, but when you sign up for Facebook, you agree that all of the data that you put on Facebook is owned by that company. They can do anything they like with it at all. I think that there's, in terms of privacy, there are very big issues, which won't have time to go into in any great detail here, which I think all of us need to at least be aware of. There's also much more potential for control and regulation in cyberspace than probably even outside of it. If you take, for example, something like browsing. Now, browsing used to be when you went into a library, you had time on your hands, or you were doing research or something, and you pick up books and you'd open them and you read stuff, you put it back on a shelf, and you basically do something which was essentially a private thing. If you do the same thing on the internet, every single word, every single page which you open is potentially visible to somebody who may wish to look at it. Now, I'm not a particularly paranoid person, so I'm not suggesting that everything you do is being watched or anything else, but the potential is there in a way that didn't exist before. And unfortunately, as time has passed, there's been increasing attempts to control and regulate what goes on the internet, and usually using fears around protection of children and protection from terrorism. Those are the two main kind of prisms in which control and regulation is seen. There are two aspects of this. One which is very clear and overt, and which Joe's already mentioned, which is the attempts by governments, such as our present Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, to introduce a database of everything everybody does on the internet and through email and everything else, and so that the state can keep track of what's going on. The Australian government's proposed compulsory internet filtering system, which I gather means that all ISPs will have to go along with it, and things like that, which are very clear attempts to regulate. But the second thing, which I think is more insidious and in many ways more dangerous, is a self-regulation, which is increasingly happening, and Joe gave some good examples of that. The informal types of regulation, and in many ways you could see that as the policeman in the head, if you like. It's where we all think twice before we allow something to happen or allow ourselves to say something or allow other people to say something. And that kind of informal self-censorship is essentially very dangerous as well. Now, I've recently been thinking about this and other things in relation to the current economic recession. And I think it's very important that we recontextualize many of the discussions that we've been having about freedom and censorship and so on in the light of what is happening in the world economy. All right? Now bear with me here, okay? Because I think that when governments feel threatened or experience threats which they do not know how to cope with, then what they normally do is become more authoritarian. That is just a fact of history. And the kind of creeping authoritarianism which we've experienced in recent years, not just in this country but elsewhere, in relation to the internet and other aspects of life, is likely to accelerate in the face of a severe economic recession. For all kinds of reasons, the state feels that it needs more control when things feel out of control. And we also, as individuals, feel more threatened, more weak, more isolated, more individuated, and we tend to become more accepting of authoritarian measures. So I see the area of freedom and censorship as becoming actually much more central to political life in the coming years than it has been even in the past. Because once you give powers to the state, for whatever apparently good reason, then the state can exercise those powers in any way that they wish. And one of the things that really struck me about the recent events in the area of finance was that Gordon Brown's government used anti-terrorist legislation to freeze the bank accounts of the Icelandic government, who, as far as I know, have no known links to any Al-Qaeda organisation, but obviously, maybe they know better than me. And that's actually what happens, is that you give the state powers for apparently good reason, but once they have them, they've got them. And then, you or anybody else can become victim to that. And I think, secondly, that the very deep nature of the recession which we're facing, and which there appears to be very little solutions available from our leaders and political leaders and others, means that we need the maximum amount of freedom to discuss and debate and come up with solutions to the problems that are going to face us, not a closing down of debate and not censorship. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Hello. I have got an approach to this, I guess, which is placed partly having been for the last 10 years an advocate of free creative speech, largely through the public radio and broadcasting sector in Australia, but also in my paid living. I've worked for a number of governments in our country and have been on the more repressive side, having in part, I was part of the team that introduced our National Paedophile Register and a number of internet laws governing grooming of children on the internet and various other things. And I think, it's sort of an obvious point worth stating, which is that there aren't absolutes which are entirely helpful in this space. You can't absolutely maintain a right to free speech, but on the other hand, its preservation requires quite fierce advocacy. And I guess I think it's absolutely right that in times of pessimism, the instinct of many governments is to control, to promote a sense that things can be better preserved and protected. And currently, in my home country in Australia, we do have a very ham-fisted approach to censoring the internet being put around. And again, as you said, the twin risks that are used to defend this are almost always protection of children and protection against terrorism, although we, being somewhat isolated, are a little less usually worried about terrorism in Australia. It happily seems quite a long way away from us most of the time. And I guess, in my home country context, it's always been important to place that in context, that the risks associated with the free speech of pedophiles, to sort of describe it in a way I guess I'm not entirely comfortable with, is not nearly as dangerous a thing to entertain as the risk of unfree speech. And by that what I mean is that unfreedoms, in the sense of people who in Zimbabwe are having their arms cut off for voting, people in China who are locked up for writing and painting, for praying. Prayer is a form of free speech which is banned in many countries. When those forms of speech are oppressed, our problems are by a great multiplicity worse than they are when we have perverts roaming around in dangerous but small numbers. And I guess it's not pleasant to talk about the manageable risks a community might agree to wear of having perverts roaming around, protecting somewhat their free speech. And I certainly, having been involved in trying to responsibly, carefully and minimally regulate the internet to prevent perverts having more access to free speech than is good for everyone, I've been quite aware of that. But I think that, I know in my own home context, I've written, for instance, that swimming pools in my country are a greater risk than pedophiles are to children. That's not something that most people are comfortable discussing, but the fact is, in Australia, everyone should give their child a computer. No one should build a swimming pool until their kids are about 10, because the thing that knocks kids off like flies in our country is backyard swimming pools. People, with the barest of regulation for the flimsiest of fences are quite happy to accommodate the swimming pool risk. But my daughter's school sends messages home continually saying that we ought not allow computers in the bedroom, that computers should only be allowed in public family space. So I'm supposed to let her only conduct her... currently, she likes to play games in Japanese, so I wouldn't have a clue what she's watching, even if I were monitoring it. So it's, the enormous personal and educational benefits that she derives from the computer are continually repressed by her school, which has banned iPods and various other electronic devices from the school on the grounds that it undermines community and public morals. And I think the thing that has been difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around is that sexual risk to children is largely from nearby known people in their lives. And I came to, I suppose, a particular understanding of this speaking to my 80-year-old neighbour Betty, who said to me that quite a number of her friends had had unpleasant encounters with teachers and priests and neighbours and various other people when she was a child, and the thing that she recalled being told all the time was, have less to say. Think about the reputation of the people that you're speaking about. Think about the consequences for the perpetrator. And that phrase, have less to say, I thought to myself, what more dangerous thing could you teach a child than to shut up? To completely make their speech unfree. And I think, as sort of slightly gross as it is, the sexual role models that matter for children are us, their parents, and demonstrating by example respectful, pleasurable sexual relationships and, demonstrating those behaviours and talking about them again, being able to freely speak about them. That's where children gain their protection from sexual predation. Censoring the internet has very little to do with it. I think also, once again, I think much of the interesting discussion will come when we open it up, so I'll keep this short. But one of the things that bothers me around the internet is the swiftness with which people who consider themselves quite bright seek to restrict the speech of people they think don't deserve free speech, that the internet has that it has given any idiot with a typewriter the opportunity to have an opinion, and that somehow that has sort of degraded the culture. I know that's a popular intellectual opinion in Australia. And I think that we need to be as accommodating as we can be about the speech of others if we want to preserve it for ourselves and everyone else. I was reminded of this recently when my radio station FBI in Sydney broadcast a fairly tasteless homage to War of the Worlds, where it was set as a 9/11 style terrorist attack on Sydney. It was a fairly I was about to say, and excuse me if some members of the audience find this offensive, I was about to say it was a slightly undergraduate sort of a political parody, which is probably slightly unfair. It was funny in parts, it was offensive in parts, but it certainly wasn't any kind of an evil, but the response that we got was quite astounding. I've never, even when we played Nine Inch Nails songs with quite graphic violent and sexual content, the limits on political free speech, I suppose, that people wanted to put on us following this broadcast were quite startling. And being able to say, look, I don't particularly enjoy this either, but what free speech is pretty meaningless if it only extends to the things that I'm interested in, or that that other people in my social circle might be interested in. And I think that the debate currently around our moves to censor the internet in Australia have been... Only a small number of voices have been enfranchised in the debate, and there is a strong view in the intellectual community that it's probably no great harm if 90% of bloggers are never heard from again, because real people with real training and real columns in real newspapers probably ought to be put back on their pedestals in the broadsheets again. And I think that's particularly sad. The one last thing I would say is that in terms of protecting the interests of children, the vast number of children in the world who are sold to sexual predators are those in countries that have very, very low incomes. And the countries with very, very low incomes have almost to a nation are the ones run by totalitarians who repress their people. Generally speaking, prosperity is a result of the free exchange of imagination, ideas and capital. And in those places where there is no freedom, there generally is no prosperity, and those are the places in which children are sold to rapists and predators. We need to preserve the energies that create prosperous, free societies, because those are the societies in which people insist on childhood. Thank you.
Thanks, Cass. We'll move on to Tim.
Good morning, everyone. What can free speech mean in an environment where almost anything can be said, but everything said is recorded? What does it further mean when what is recorded is fundamentally text, although increasingly video and audio, but largely text, and therefore is keyword searchable by computers? The internet seems to offer something about free speech that transfers control away from large institutions, so bloggers, netizens, intermedia, hacktivists, all seem to reflect a potential based on the vastly reduced costs of producing media objects and the vastly reduced costs and increased opportunities for distributing media objects that the internet allows. So the gap between production and consumption is radically altered through the internet, and that has consequences for the nature of free speech. Yet what does it mean when each such viewpoint produced is recorded, whether by the internet service provider that, of necessity, the communication has to go through, or by spookier kinds of programs like the Echelon program, or some of the ones that have just been mentioned that are emerging? Some people have seen such a context to mean that the free speech the internet offers is merely an invitation to surveillance and ultimately to prosecution of some people. Yet the free speech hasn't gone away, despite the surveillance. There's a distinction opening up that needs some exploration between a lack of privacy not necessarily equating with censorship. control of free speech is both lessened and increased. And in a sense, it's changed conditions of free speech that the internet offers. It's an interesting argument whether it's more or less, but there are certainly changed conditions. Let me give an example reasonably quickly. The Tor network, or Tor Park as it's sometimes called, is a means of anonymising particular forms of online communication. It's run by volunteers based on open source software. You basically have a Firefox web browser or a plug-in to your Firefox browser that automatically connects you to a cloud of Tor servers. The servers themselves are run by volunteers. Any one of us with a computer and internet connection and the ability to set up a server can download, set up a Tor server and become part of this cloud of around currently 800 to 1,000 servers. Your communication then travels from your browser, hits the cloud of servers, encrypted at each jump. Each jump is broken and anonymised and handed off randomly to several other servers until you access the information, then it's transferred back through a virtual circuit. Any lack of activity breaks the circuit and a new one is produced. In this way, attempting to create a block to various forms of surveillance that are possible on the internet. It's not perfect, it doesn't cover everything, there's all sorts of ways of breaking it and so on, or there's all sorts of things that it doesn't protect against. And Tor Park servers have been impounded, for example, in Germany during a paedophilia investigation. So what kind of freedom of speech is managed here? It's one that tries to retain the freedom while removing the inherent surveillance the internet allows. A type of free speech designed explicitly for human rights activists in difficult situations, but open to anyone to use. There's an interesting political calculation at play in Tor, in which the servers are largely intended to be located in liberal democracies, where it is perceived that there is much less possibility of prosecution. And the users are tended to be perceived to be in countries which have repressive human rights regimes. So it's not expected that you run a Tor Park server in China because of the expectation of repression. But it is expected that human rights activists in the kinds of places that Joe mentioned before will be able to use the Tor Park servers, which are going to be located in Europe and the US, on the presumption that liberal democracies will allow those things, and it's much harder to prosecute people. So there's an interesting political calculation that produces a particular form of technology. Once that technology is created, certain forms of action are determined and are available to all of us. So who designed it? Well, the US Navy designed it, in conjunction with a hacker-inspired organisation. The US Office of Naval Research and the Free Haven Project developed it. This has led to, as you would expect with the internet, a number of conspiracy theories about the fact that the US Navy might have produced some software, might have just left a back door in so that anyone using this network is automatically going to be picked out and recorded. The answer from the director of the project was, do you know that Tor was openly designed by the Naval Research Lab, who sent it out into the world as open source? Do you know that as open source, Tor cannot have any backdoors because there are thousands of programmers all over the world who look at the code and understand it? The nature of controlling the internet here is guaranteed by openness, by the possibility of many eyes seeing a program, which itself constructs part of the nature of the internet. The ability to do something through, with, or on the internet, in part is created through Tor, which creates a little bit of the internet, the fabric, the nature of it, the nature of space and communication in there. This is open to all of us, but it's in terms of the openness of being secure about open source software, it's open to all of us. Any of us can download and look at the source code of any bit of open source software. Only a few of us can do that meaningfully. It becomes a freedom guaranteed by certain experts who can read code. And the freedom or the security is guaranteed by openness, by the hope or the expectation that there will be coders out there who will check or look. What I've outlined in relationship to free speech and in relationship to the interplay between social and political determinations of technologies that in turn then determine certain social and political constraints and actions on the internet, so an interplay between various forms of determination, is, I think, common to all forms of control and contestation on the internet. Like a nation state, the internet is not subject to control from one and only one source. It's riven by different forms of power, from those of institutions, from governments, from the users. But all such forms of power funnel through these moments where technologies are opened up for reconsideration and then are closed down, and we all have different levels of interrelation. And this is much more kind of fluid on the internet than in other parts of our lives where we similarly can run into forms of technology because of the nature of software, because software is so malleable. Governments and corporations can enrol large numbers of programmers, as we've seen, just to raise the £800 gorilla, in Microsoft's repeated efforts to create a Microsoft flavour of the internet, .NET, its ongoing attempt to maintain the dominance of Internet Explorer as examples. On the other hand, free and open source software provides a kind of geek counterculture which offers an odd security in the openness of the code to the assessment of experts. And what these processes create is not straightforward. Surveillance and free speech go hand in hand. Control of an infrastructure like software to create blogging and forums goes hand in hand with unpredictable uses of them. The internet is both out of control and under control simultaneously. You get free speech and total surveillance together. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've had a good lot of views in there, and a lot I think that people might want to respond to. So I'll just kick it off up here. I mean, I'm quite interested in from what people have been saying. Do you think that there is a space to defend an absolute concept of free speech when it comes to the internet? And how would we go about doing that with the rise of the blogosphere, with sites like YouTube and Wikipedia, where it often seems that what content is available on the site is down to the users to decide themselves, or it's up to the website owners themselves to be responsible for what is held on the site? I mean, is there a way of talking about free speech absolutely when it comes to the internet? Joan?
Well, I think quite clearly from what everybody's said, the answer is no. I mean, that you have this contradiction, as I think has come out clearly from what everybody's said, that on the one hand you've got this extraordinary, unprecedented opportunity for freedom of speech, for everybody to engage in all sorts of ways, and you have this control. And I think that there are, in many ways, it has... the threats to free speech in many ways are greater. And I just, one sort of very interesting example is the extent to which local laws, the laws of different countries that inhibit speech within those countries, have now broken out of their territories. So that you have somebody who thinks they're saying something just in Australia or just in America, but if you can download it in Germany and it's illegal in Germany, then the Germans can come and get you. And that is a quite remarkable change. It's not new. We've seen it, the pivotal case was with Yahoo when they were forced to take down Nazi memorabilia that was available in France, and that was the sort of clincher case. But that's a very important example, I think, of how the threats to free speech have increased.
Cass, yeah?
The Nazi speech is a really interesting example of that. I found myself quite, focused on that recently, because there's a difference between an image of a child being assaulted and somebody saying something offensive. There's some quite interesting and useful literature I've noticed on your chairs and on the shelves that I was reading earlier, and I think the phrase in one of those things up there says that the image of a child being assaulted preserves an illegal assault upon a citizen, and preserves that violation and shares it with everybody. I think that is in a different category of offence and requires a different level of public response than people saying repulsive and offensive things which don't constitute a physical assault on another citizen. Not that it isn't a problem, but I just think that many more people in the world are suffering and dying today because of the unfreedom of their necessary speech, because of their right to speak and blog and pray as they see fit, than would ever be harmed by a random handful of morons sort of espousing moronic attitudes. I just think the lumping in of all manner of offensive conduct into the same category as sort of the worst forms of pornography is, I don't think we should allow the lines to be blurred that much. You need to, I suppose a long-term view of mine has been all public policy is on the slippery slope. There are no golden threads of argument that protect you. You can't say free speech is an absolute and I need think no more about it. That's just the way it is. But once you're on the slippery slope and you've decided it's not okay to share particular images or writing, you actually need to engage a lot more actively than I think most communities do.
I think that for me, free speech only means something if it offends you. I mean, if all you're saying is free speech is all right as long as it's things which I agree with or concur with, that isn't free speech. And the whole concept of it, I think, has been degraded over the years in terms of what's seen as being acceptable. For me, free speech is an absolute. Actually, I do think that if we allow state regulation of speech, of ideas, then we have lost free speech. I mean, it's indivisible. It either exists or it doesn't. You can't have free speech up to a point. And I think that's a very important principle to establish. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that illegal acts should be allowed. I mean, that's quite a different thing. Child rape is a crime, and the people who commit it, record it, use it for making money should be punished. No question about that. But that's a crime in anybody's book. But the right to speak is something quite different. Now, there is a problem here, and I think this is something which we all need to discuss, because there's a difference between private speech and free speech. And the problem with the internet is that it has eroded that differential. So there are things that in the past I might have said to somebody on this platform. I mean, I remember, to give you a good example, in the 80s when everybody hated the Tories, it was not uncommon for people to go around saying they should blow the whole lot up. Now, if you put that in an email or on your website now, you'd be in Belmarsh prison within 5 minutes. Because obviously they didn't mean it, and it was said to your friends or somebody in the pub, but now it would be recorded and visible and probably alert, there's a keyword kind of search from MI5, blow up, and then you'd be whisked away. So I think we do have a problem here, which I don't actually really know what the answer to is, as it happens, because there are things that should only be said in private. All sorts of things, intimate things, things you don't really want the world to know about you and your relationships with your friends.
They don't want to know either.
Yeah, exactly. But the internet has eroded that difference, and I think that's a much more interesting discussion actually as to what does that mean. I mean, does that mean that we all need to exercise more self-restraint in what we put online or on our Facebook pages? I mean, might do. But that again is a form of kind of self-censorship. So I think that's quite an interesting area to examine.
Okay, thanks. And just to bring Tim into the discussion, I mean, what do you think about this distinction between the private and the public sphere when it comes to the internet? I mean, how do you join that up with what you've been saying about open source software, people sharing how they put things together? Does that map at all?
One of the interesting things is the total surveillance idea, which I floated up, appears in lots of different places. You'll find it. It's in a sense, it's a kind of dystopia. It's a morality tale about the nature of the internet. What's possible and so on. It teaches us something about the internet. What's remarkable is both with it, and in another realm, text messaging is a very similar kind of case, which is that people tend to know everything's seen and don't care, partly because who cares about what people are running through. So there's been I think there is an interesting bit of the internet where, because everything is recordable in some ways, but it's a much more vernacular, much more private seeming, much more intimate seeming form of communication, often pinging odd emails about, dropping jokes in on forums, instant messaging with people. Because of that, it feels kind of private, but to a certain extent it doesn't matter. It matters when you become a human rights activist. It matters when you start to be picked out for some reason. It matters when what you're doing happens to become political, whether you realise it or not. The famous case, early internet case, is the Canadian one about the guy who wrote, or North American one who wrote violent pornography in a Usenet group, but identified some real women in his violent pornography, never did anything, and was prosecuted for it. So there are, they're the kind of cases which have been around the possibilities of the internet for some time. What I think is we need to pay attention to as well are the conditions. What is changing in the conditions? And what the internet does is not just alter some things, but it alters the nature of privacy. It alters the nature of free speech and stuff.
Okay, thanks. I think Joe
Yeah,
wants to go.
I just reference what you were saying about that case. There's a very interesting case coming up here, which is which a lot of you might have read about, which is this prosecution of this civil servant who'd written a kind of piece of violent fantasy pornography based around unspeakable things he wanted to do to girls aloud. And he is being prosecuted. It's the first case of written material on the internet being prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. There hasn't been a prosecution under the Obscene Publications Act of written material, it's normally images, since the early 90s. And the real era for those prosecutions was the 60s and 70s. So that's potentially quite a watershed case which will come up next year.
Okay, thanks. So we'll come out to the audience now for any comments or questions. There is a roving mic if you would like to use that, and I would point out we are being monitored, we are being filmed in this public space this morning. So if you do have a problem with that, just look at the floor or something. Okay, yes, thanks.
Hi. Is there any way of totally guaranteeing anonymity? I can't even say it properly. On the internet, would that be a solution for not being able to identify the sources of material to avoid prosecution and allowing a freer space? Or is that something that the governments would just totally prevent, like trying to sort of have access to encryption systems and stuff?
Sorry, just to clarify, is there any way of guaranteeing anonymity when one is using the internet? Was that
be a technological solution, or is that going to be open to government prevention? Yeah.
Thanks.
Quick observations before my question. I went into the library and set off the filter or whatever it was. I typed in Marks and Spencer, so I guess they sell lingerie and that's a keyword or whatever. Also, I'm told in your country, one of your local governments puts something which their parliament discussed about sex education, but you can't access it because the filter doesn't let you get it. My actual question is, it's where to the country, if you want. This isn't actually censorship as such, but I said there's this good programme on the BBC. It rang up my sister who lives in Switzerland. She can't actually watch the iPlayer because BBC will only play to this country. You need a UK ISP address because of copyright reasons. Would the open source software get around that? And to what extent can you anonymise yourself? I'm interested. I don't think that's figures for what proportion of people who go on the web actually look at porn. I'm talking about adult porn, not what have you. I suspect the main defence is actually there's so much of it about. I don't know. I don't spend much time looking at porn. Let me hasten to add, since I'm being recorded, it's not me, but I'm told an awful lot of people do. Interesting to know what the situation is and how much, if we did record people watching porn, how much would actually be picked up.
Okay, from anonymity to pornography. Anybody else?
I was just wondering about these sort of twin bogeymen, terrorism and paedophilia, and it's a bit of a shame that you have to keep on coming back to these ones, but especially the kiddie fiddling, that seems to, excite people intellectually. But I'm just wondering, is it actually illegal for me to see an image by mistake on my computer? For example, a friend of mine has got a web page. He's an artist. And there's some kind of Al-Qaeda group keep on hacking in, so that as soon as you try and go further in his webpage, you get all these adverts for amateur bomb making recipes, which I quite like. I like explosives. But would it be the case that if the same thing happened...
You turn the camera off.
So, no. If it was a similar situation with some kind of, paedophile thing, would that make me illegal? And remembering, obviously, that there's probably hardly anybody in this country, apart from paedophiles, know what kiddie porn looks like, because we're not allowed to see it. Not that I want to, but, just for intellectual curiosity, it's like the unknown unknowns. That's a bit mad, I think.
Okay, thank you. Cassandra would like to make a quick observation.
Everybody's saying that there was a rule apparently when McCain was looking for a vice presidential running mate that you had to sign you had to verify in writing that you'd never ever looked at pornography on the internet. And one of the theories on how he came to have a female running mate was apparently because of this porn waiver that everybody had. I'm thinking, perhaps like you, has she not turned on a computer? Because I don't know of anybody who hasn't seen any porn on the internet.
Okay, thanks. I think we have another question.
Hi. When you request a page from the internet, you are going to have to ask a DNS server where it is. You're going to have to send that request to a router, an ISP, and all these a vast array of machinery and technology that has to be run and maintained and powered and is frequently privately owned. And they're essentially providing you these services for free, or for a price, either way. But so if those are all kind of private companies, what responsibility do they have to you other than what you've agreed to already? And why should we expect something from them that we're not able to kind of set up our own system? We have to rely on them. So why do we have to expect them to uphold our interests?
Okay, thanks. Anybody else for this round? Oh, yeah, the guy just in front, thanks.
Well, I was going to say two things, which was about the McCain-Palin video on YouTube. The issue with that was, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the law is, and McCain voted for this like a couple of years ago, that the people who own the copyright can tell infringing content, can tell YouTube to just take it down. And obviously, because they'll get millions of requests each day or week, they can't check everyone to see if it's true. So, very well, we shouldn't be taking things down which have a right to be up there, but how can we, if we don't have the resources to check, then, what is a reasonable solution? And the second was that you said there was no, you either have free speech or you don't. But what about situations where, on the internet or not, like Abu Hamza and inciting terrorist hatred just in East London preaching, how is that at all beneficial to society, even if it is supporting free speech, if it causes bombings and all that sort of thing?
Okay, thank you. Lady just over here, thanks.
Excuse me. Do the panellists think it's a bit all a one-way street in terms of openness or the censorship? Because I've been wondering whether or not the need to innovate, developing economies, all the rest of it actually means that the openness on the internet also has to extend. And so that in of itself also appears contradictory, that the need for governments to engage is equally an issue as is the tendency towards repression. So it does seem that there's also a contradiction there.
Okay, thank you. Is there one more? Okay, yeah.
Two quick observations, I guess. The first thing is that I actually work for an ISP, and you're talking about takedown stuff here, which is a big issue that's being discussed in our community at the moment. The actual number of takedown requests is actually pretty low. I mean, if you think about about 100,000 websites being hosted, you're probably talking about maybe one every couple of weeks. So it's a pretty low amount of effort to actually investigate those and actually see what is really going on. And you haven't got, and there's no, I mean, certainly we have a policy, I know lots of our other peers in the industry have a policy of not doing takedowns unless there is a criminal matter involved effectively. And so if there is something civil involved, we'll sit back, we understand the law, and we'll sit back and let that continue and draw our conclusions subsequently. So we don't go for that kind of thing. The other observation is that I was privy to a conversation between some ministers a couple of months ago who were talking about the regulation of the internet in particular. And it's incredible, they really have no understanding of how it really works. And they've got this really bizarre idea about it. They reckon they're going to put some little black box somewhere, and they're going to know everything that's going on everywhere. It's just not the way it works. And their notions about it are completely impractical, and they're highly unlikely to ever be successful in it, even if they tried. So there we go. One final observation. The other thing is that, as the gentleman there said, that when you use the internet, there are a wide variety of things that your data goes through, and it is very difficult to say that it's going to be truly anonymous all the time and everything else. And it's also because you've got to actually a lot of the logging that is done on these devices is done for technical reasons. I.e., if something goes wrong, you can check back afterwards and that kind of thing. So there are some issues with that as well. But there are probably more things that the community could do to make things more anonymous if that was the thing to be done, I guess.
Okay, thanks. So we'll come back up to the panel. I just want to jump in with a question to Joe. I mean, this Abu Hamza case I thought might be something you were interested to comment on. I mean, do you think this is something specifically to do with the web? Is it something to do with the anti-terror legislation that we've seen recently? How would you go about?
I don't think that question about Abu Hamza is specifically to do with the web. The question of whether you should allow people like Abu Hamza to preach hate is a much wider free speech question. And I personally feel that unless they're actually Abu Hamza is standing in the streets, actually inciting violence against a group that violence is likely to happen, I don't think these people that it should be illegal for the very reasons that have been outlined earlier about the protection of free speech. That really protecting free speech means we have to put up with a lot of speech that we don't like, that we find offensive, that is very unpleasant. But that is the guarantee for protecting all of our speech. And if we start protecting just the speech that we like, that's no protection. But I just want just to address just a couple of the other questions as well. The whole question of, whether if you find yourself downloading sort of pornography or no, I'm not just looking at you. I'm just looking at sort of general audience direction. Pornography or something, or a Al Qaeda website, whether that's illegal. And yes, it is. It is illegal. The act of downloading that material is and possessing it. The possession, once you've downloaded it and you possess it, it's potentially illegal. But the question is, who is doing the downloading? How interested are the police going to be in you? I think particularly with these the question of downloading terrorist material. I just saw in the paper on the way here that there's been an arrest just yesterday, I think, of somebody who has possessing a document under the Terrorism Act 2000. If you download the Al Qaeda manual, for example, or one of these other pieces of literature, you could be prosecuted for that. And there was a case that there was a lot of fuss about earlier this year of this young chap in Nottingham, I think it was, a graduate who a friend of his had downloaded some of this literature. He was doing research. They both ended up getting arrested and detained under the Terrorism Act. So yeah, in answer to your question. And there was one other, the question of Palin and McCain, and I think there's a big problem here as to what you do, and I think that I'm not sure what the answer is, but there has to be some kind of answer to I mean, for them particularly it was urgent, because obviously if something is taken down in that way, it can be put up again. There is a procedure for that, but when you're fighting an election campaign, you haven't got the time to wait for that kind of procedure to go through its paces.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I suppose there's an issue as well. I mean, do you think the web is seen as being a political space nowadays? I mean, do you think that it's portrayed as being somewhere where both democracy can be enlivened and extremism can run riot? So, I mean, I don't know if you saw Jackie Smith was announcing at the end of last week that she wanted to bar people from Britain who were preaching hate. The question then being, well, what's the point of kicking them out of the country if they can then publish their views on the internet? I mean, do you see this as causing some sort of problem, or any other member of the panel would like to kind of try and tease apart that for us?
Well, I think with all these things, as you know, the big pronouncements, as you were saying earlier, that the government, you know, it's very interesting to hear you say, from your perspective, that the government doesn't have a clue about. Yeah, and that is kind of laughable and terrifying, you know, at the same time, that here they are pronouncing, we're going to stamp down on pornography, we're going to stamp down on terrorism, we're going to regulate. They don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Okay, thanks, Jo. Sorry, we'll just get Tim in and then we'll come to Rob, yeah.
I'm going to pick up on the can you be anonymous point, because I think it's a tangent, but it's relevant to these kind of discussions. There's two things about it. You can probably, I mean, this is open to argument, but you can probably encrypt. You have to distinguish your message and the path of your message and whether that can be followed. You can probably encrypt your stuff so it's incredibly hard to be decrypted. Then you can be prosecuted for refusing to give up your key to decrypt it. Yeah? But if you really want to go to prison rather than let someone see something, you can probably make it incredibly hard for message. Whether you can be anonymous in terms of where you send the message is far more difficult. But what I want to mention to bring out is that these systems are systems in struggle. The kind of hacktivist community that is working around kind of creating secure communications is producing all manner of bits of software. So I mentioned Tor, which protects only a particular thing. It is actually aimed at protecting the passage of material. So it's assuming that your information is encrypted and can't be read easily. What it's trying to anonymise is the passage of your packets on the internet so that you can't be traced where you went and where it went back. There are other things like Camera Shy, where using particular browsers and knowing the password, you can put information in a picture, put it up on a web page, and the other person who knows it's there can go and get the information out of the picture, but to everyone else it's just a picture. But it's a struggle. I don't think there's any security. And the internet was based on, and as someone mentioned DNS servers, the internet's based on having to identify each other. And the people with the greatest interest in anonymity in the internet's history have been crackers, the serious crackers who've been trying to break into various websites and so on. And in general, once they're under surveillance, what information they send out from wherever they are can be followed back. So it's not necessarily, anonymity is a really problematic subject, and it's subject to struggle, technological struggle of various sorts and political struggle, but it would be very difficult to completely anonymise your presence on the internet.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Rob?
Well, I think the question of downloading stuff, I think, is very interesting. I mean, I think that there are some things which have become crimes which shouldn't be crimes. So incitement shouldn't be a crime, in my book. I think that it's crossed the line to start saying that what people say is in itself a criminal thing. And so there are some things which just should be allowed. However distasteful, however much we hate it, I'm not saying that, if Abu Hamza tells three guys, you should be going off and blowing up the underground, he shouldn't be arrested, but if they go off and do it, they should be arrested. They are the people who are doing something, he's just talking about it. And I think if we cross that line, then we have basically started to say that speech is itself a criminal thing. Now, when child pornography, I think that's obviously something very difficult, because I've got children, and you feel very sort of personal about the whole thing. But I would say that, as I said earlier, child rape is a crime. If you see it, whether it's happening round the corner from you or on film, then actually you should report it to the police, right? Just as you would any other crime, what any good citizen would do, that is what you should do. But the act of seeing it shouldn't itself be a crime. I think that's something else. And it's a very hard distinction to make. And I think there is also a case that people who pay to see it are actually colluding in the act itself, and should be exposed in some way. Because it's morally wrong, and we don't just lock. We have views about what goes on in society. Some things we think are illegal. Some things we think are wrong, which are illegal. Some things which we think are wrong because they're immoral, but they're not illegal. And I think that's where we wage a campaign to say people should not watch this stuff for pleasure, right? They shouldn't. And that's something which we would like established in our society. But that's a social thing rather than a legal thing. So I think there's all the time I would want to make a distinction between the people who do things and the people who say things. And if we cross over that line and say that the people who say things are criminal, then we have eroded the principle of free speech.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I'm just going to jump in with two questions. One to Tim. Anonymity. Do we care? Should we care? If we're defending the internet as a public space, is that not about identifying ourselves and who we are and sort of being very open about that?
Well, it depends what you're doing, whether you want to be anonymous or not. If you want to buy anything on the internet, that tracks you. How did Pete Townsend get caught? Credit card details. So it depends what you're doing, whether you want to be anonymous or not. You used to be able to go and buy things, pay for it with cash. It's anonymous. You had the object, the cash is gone, the cash can't be traced back to you. Over the internet now, there's been various projects based around creating digital forms of anonymous I don't know which way I read it, anonymous forms of digital cash, none of which have really taken off because people are gaily happy to use their credit cards and it's much easier, or to use PayPal and stuff like that. In the vast majority of cases, most of us don't seem to care, which I think is where the gap between privacy and free speech has started to open up with the internet, and in a way that hasn't quite happened prior to the internet. And I think that's kind of interesting gap that's opened up. But it does depend what you're doing.
Can I get a quick clarification? Maybe the jet lag, but I don't think I was entirely clear. I'm exactly not supporting an entirely open right to free speech, because I think one of the reasons, having advised politicians for a decade or more and having advised politicians on legislating around the internet from time to time in my life, there are, I say, and partly it comes back to the question you were saying, we've put in the hands of a number of companies the responsibility to make decisions about free speech on our behalf. And in this, I kind of come back to, I always think, well, thank God for the Americans and their Bill of Rights and constitutional culture, because there are, as you discussed earlier, shareholders and others trying to promote a culture that actually comes back to discussions which the Americans have largely led. They've had 200 years of discussion around, is it okay to yell fire in a theatre? Is it okay to talk about blowing things up when in fact you have a relationship of authority with the people that you're speaking to? It's not just free speech, it's actually more of an instruction, which is quite different. And you would prosecute people in the IRA who had a relationship of authority, who told people it would be quite good if you did X, Y and Z. In the case of pornography, many are producing it for a marketplace. So the customer is in fact inciting a crime in much the same way as a person who purchases an assassination or purchases a crime of any kind might do. And we acknowledge in a range of legislations that in fact speaking about things and doing things, there isn't a clear-cut, ironclad line in the sand, I don't have to think about it anymore argument that settles those questions. They may be settled in the minds of some people in the intellectual debate, but for most citizens, and clearly a lot of you feel uncomfortable about it, it's not that clear. The line between speech and action is not defined that well.
Okay, thanks, Cass. We're coming to the end of the time that we have specifically allocated for this debate, but we can run over a bit, so I'm going to come back out for very quick comments, questions. For those of you that want to get in, if it's just a short comment, a question about something that somebody has said, please do that now, but keep it brief. Thank you.
Just a quick one. Although I'm very sympathetic to Rob's view, I'm afraid speech is an act, and you can separate what the philosopher J.L. Austin said, the locutionary force, which is the semantic content, The illocutionary force is the kind of Speech Act it is, and the perlocutionary force is what you're trying to bring about it. Unfortunately, every single Speech Act tries to bring things about, so your sharp distinction with which I wish it was true doesn't actually hold up. But I'm very interested to look at the balance on the panel, which is a feeling perhaps of anxiety and despair about overregulation. And the question is how you respond to that. Is it technological? Is it political? You try and regulate the regulators, or is it in fact an overall ethos in society that has to be inculcated?
Okay, thank you. That was Professor Raymond Tallis. Anybody else? Quick question, quick point. Lots of people look like they're about to make a point, but aren't.
I was just wondering where the panel thought that verbal abuse came in. If you have an absolute belief in freedom of speech, then surely it shouldn't be a crime to say whatever you like to anybody about anything.
Yep, okay, thank you very much. Any last questions or comments? No, okay, so I'll just come back to the panel. Oh, sorry, yep.
Sorry, mine is just a quick one on censorship. With the increase of watching television over the web, are the same laws apply? Do the same laws apply?
Okay, so difference between television and the internet, yeah. Okay, thanks. Anybody on the panel want to respond to those specific three questions that we've heard just then?
Yeah, no, I just want to say the whole sort of massive hornet's nest of what is free speech and what isn't free speech. It is a question that, you know, everybody's got big differences on. Countries have big differences on in their legislation. America has the greatest constitutional protection for free speech of any country in the world. So that, for example, where the question about abuse, incitement to hatred, is illegal here. And the laws against incitement to hatred have proliferated under this government. Those kinds of laws are not applied in the States. It's a much higher threshold. There has to be clear and present danger that an act of violence is going to take place. Now, there is discussion in the States. There have been sort of some books written recently. They're actually sort of looking at this and saying, well, actually, should we have laws that are much more like European hate speech laws? So, you know, this is a debatable question, but obviously, Index on Censorship, we're in support of freedom of speech. We obviously recognise there are cases where, particularly in the case of incitement to violence, but at an American threshold is where we would put it. But these are questions to which there is, you know, clearly there isn't agreement.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Well, I think that I think that if you're part of a command structure of some terrorist organisation and you're the person who gives the order, then that's a crime. But those crimes already existed. Right? There was no need for new legislation to deal with that. The Incitement Act is actually to deal with precisely something quite different, which is people who, generally speaking, have views about things which other people find unacceptable, particularly in relation to acts of terrorism. And I think that, you know, I do think that there is a distinction there. The crying fire in a crowded building is a very, very specific thing, which is basically about creating a panic which is going to lead to immediate casualties. Is not the same thing as expressing your views about what's going on in Afghanistan or somewhere else. So I think, you know, that it is important to hold that. Sorry, Ray. I think it is important to hold to that distinction, if only for the fact that as soon as you give it away, then there is no distinction anymore. That's the problem with it. You know, and if everything we say is liable to be policed and you know, open to prosecution and so on, then we're in a very, very difficult thing. I mean, I'm not saying, by the way, that what people say should go uncontested. I think it's very important. I mean, loosely translating what Voltaire said about free speech, let's remember, he said, I defend to the death your right to say you know, anything you like, even if it really offends me. I also defend my right to knock you down for saying it. And I think that the important thing is not to say this is not like some liberal free, everyone can say what they like and there are no consequences. But we need to have debates out about what's going on in all of these different things, and not suppress them, not lock people up because they are saying things that we don't like.
I've always been quite optimistic about the internet and its ability in the kind of cloud of stuff, despite the kind of surveillance possibilities that we passed over, in the cloud of kind of massive cloud of stuff that it produces, for it to it to progressively kind of maintain a kind of set of, kind of free speeches. The internet's not totally controlled by corporations. I mean, most of us go through corporations in one form or another, but there's a huge amount of stuff out there that runs the internet that's not simply corporate-based. And so it's more complex than that. And I've always had faith in the cluelessness of governments, in the face of complex technological objects. But it is something to be aware of. I was just reminded, this is my driving licence, which I got earlier this year. That's my picture and my signature, and I never sent that to them to get this. I never sent it to them. I went online and said,
"Maybe they're smarter than you think."
Yeah, I get your license online. I said, "Yeah, I can sit here in my computer in my trackies and do it instead of having to, And I went, and I didn't believe it would happen, but because of my last passport application, they've got my picture and my signature, and this then popped through my letterbox. So while I do have faith in the cluelessness of governments, particularly when they get confronted with things, when ministers get confronted with things like IP numbers and DNS servers. I mean, I'm a sociologist. I have enough bloody trouble with it, and it's my area of research. How are they ever going to get a clue when they swap ministries every kind of 6 months or so? But it's not a guarantee. It is a kind of technological struggle, and I feel quite optimistic in lots of ways about what the internet produces and what capabilities and what won't be there. But it's not straightforward.
I think just in closing, I'd like to share something about optimism, I guess, as well, and that's that in 2006, and I don't know what the figures are today, but it's recent enough to be interesting, I hope, the most common language for blogging on the internet was Farsi, which is what they speak in Iran. And I just think that it's very much worth remembering and celebrating what an incredible gift free speech is to thousands of millions of people around the world who don't have it. And it's very much incumbent on us to make sure that it's not just politicians who are trying to grapple with this, but that everyone in our community, we will never get it absolutely right. There aren't any golden threads of British justice or other grand principles that will answer the question for us. But the better we do on getting these questions settled for our community, the better we preserve freedoms which are essential to everyone else in the world as well.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for...